All right, YouTube, don't mind the Minecraft music if you hear it because I've got Minecraft open at the moment. North Korea is reheating yet again. Of course, this comes in the wake of a short time ago, uh, Kim sending apparently a fax to South Korea saying we might attack without warning. Those kind of stunts are fairly normal in North Korea. Again, I pointed out before, the only real difference now is that Korea and China, the North Koreans and the Chinese, seem to have had a falling out of sorts, with Kim, of course, now apparently was drunk at the time when he ordered the deaths of several of his uncle Jang's aides, and then, of course, had Jang executed along with even more aides, and apparently it's like 8 people now that have been purged. So this, again, as I said before, does kind of change the game in North Korea, because what you have now is it seems that China, which has now okayed sanctions earlier this year on North Korea, seems no longer to care if the North Koreans really exist. Probably because they want to trade with the Western world. They realize that they're being held back by this backwards little neighbor of now little strategic value. I don't think they really care if the Korean Peninsula is reunited anymore. The detriment to China of having a squarely Western country directly on its border, that's less negative than having to continually feed the North Koreans money and deal with their warmongering, with the possibility that Kim could eventually get a nuclear material that's capable of going onto a missile rather than currently what they have, which is relatively crude explosives of a small size that nonetheless won't even fit on the missiles that they use. But now Kim is again ratcheting it up, and I can't wait to watch North Korean television there. And I'll put a link in the description. It's not on 24/7. The hours are very strange. Here, it's like 3 a.m. to like 7 a.m. or something, I think, except on weekends when it's a lot later. It's really hard to understand, but I'll put a link to the Chosun TV feed, which opens in Windows Media Player, VLC, and a few others. I can't wait to watch their propaganda because right now Kim is telling his troops to be ready for imminent combat. Is this posturing? I will say no. I see the current situation in North Korea as different from, certainly in March, it was even different than before. In March, what you had never seen these little conflicts last that long. It lasted for more than a week. Usually, when Kim Jong-il was the president, or the prime minister, or the Führer, or whatever the hell they call their leader, when Kim Jong-il was the one in charge, there was exactly one time when they actually undertook any military ventures, and that was to bomb some islands, and they did that primarily for food aid. The problem is now, you've got to understand, North Korea, they're not dumb. They do things with a reason. And it can't be that they want more aid because the West has already told them to go fuck themselves. The Chinese right now are furious with Kim for executing Jiang, who wanted to move them directly into a Chinese sphere. They would have become an extension, almost a satellite state of China. Executing Jiang was a clear sign that the North Koreans want no part in the Chinese game any more than they want in on the West's game. So if they don't want aid from either China or the West, and clearly they don't want to intimidate the West because nobody in the West is intimidated by an insular regime that they have the ability to hit South Korea, they can kind of hit Japan. Anything else is too far for any of their materials to travel without getting shot out of the sky. So they're not doing it for aid, and they're not doing it to intimidate anyone. What's left? The two possibilities that I can see that are left are, number one, Kim really is insane, actually thinks he can attack and take over South Korea. Or number two, he's completely desperate. I would say the latter is far more likely. I think the most likely scenario is you see the DPRK currently unraveling. Because the Chinese now aren't really feeding them resources. They're still trading with them, albeit on a more limited scale. But North Korea right now is still going through a several years long famine. What you seem to see, and because North Korea can't feed itself, it doesn't have the technology to raise enough crops to feed its own population on the amount of arable land that it has. And not a lot of its land is highly arable. You've got a strip along one side of the country. That's basically where all the major agriculture is done. What I think is the case is that the DPRK is far more unstable than most people would think. I think that there are various coup attempts in the country, not necessarily active, but in the planning stages. I think people are grouping into their own little factions. I think Kim knows this, realizes that he's going to have to do one of several things. He's either going to have to suck Chinese dick, which the nationalists in his country, if they saw him doing that, would overthrow him. Or he sucks Western dick, in which case the nationalists in his country will overthrow him. Or the people revolt because they continue starving, in which he gets overthrown. Or the only way out of him being overthrown, if North Korea is as bad as it seems that it is getting over there with the lack of food and the lack of everything else, the only way out for Kim is to at least attempt a war with South Korea. Because to Kim, look at it from his perspective, if he's really a nationalist, which I think he is. He doesn't want to be overthrown because he's seen buddying with the Chinese. You see, the problem is North Korea has been completely insular. Their people have been told that they don't need anybody else, that the state will supply everything, that they are rich. They are told that the outside world is more impoverished than the world they're in. There are a few places in China right along the border that they're actually allowed to visit, some of these North Korean factory workers and truckers and stuff. And these borderlands in China are deliberately kept more shabby in the areas the North Koreans are going to make it seem like they're not quite as rich. It's a tip of the hat to Kim. Kim can't buddy to the Chinese or the West because the people will see that as a sign of complete weakness. They'll say something strange is going on here, and there is the real risk of even the military defecting, because even the military, except for the higher-up generals, honestly think that North Korea is the greatest country on earth and has the most wealth. So he can't buddy up to anyone, and he can't remain insular if the DPRK goes into an even worse famine, which with the weather patterns being what they are right now, it's not looking good for North Korea. So he's going to perhaps be forced into going to war with South Korea. The idea would be this. He's going to get removed from power anyway, so he probably doesn't care if he dies, because the North Koreans, any time there's a coup or anything in that region of the world, people die. Kim would be the first on the list. He'd hang for, some trumped-up criminal charge. So I think he probably will eventually be pushed into a war with South Korea. When's the time frame for this? I have no clue. But when you see them restarting their nuclear reactors, which they reportedly have started to do now, they're restarting Yongbyon and these other reactor sites, they're ramping up production at chemical sites, they're moving more and more troops to the southern border. I looked at one article that said back like 10 years ago they had 40% of their troops along the DMZ. Now it's 70%. That should worry people in South Korea. And other people have pointed this out. They said, well, it's no problem. The North Koreans would lose anyway. Yeah, I agree. They would lose. The problem is they have chemical weapons. They have biological agents. They have an enormous amount of artillery. And they could probably level most of Seoul or however the hell you pronounce it, before the South would be able to mount a reasonable defense. There goes half the population of South Korea, that city and its outlying areas, getting pounded completely by artillery, getting gassed. You would apparently, the North Koreans have plague germs and cholera and anthrax and all of these other goodies that they can deliver with a simple artillery shell. In a vaporized form, killing even more millions of people. It would erupt into a complete chaos. Here's something else for people. I don't personally buy into the belief that the Nazi regime was completely insane. I think that their own reasons were way more complicated than simply they lost their minds. But if you look at some of the quotes by the Nazi regimes, They seem similar to the kind of rhetoric that you hear from North Korea. Oh, we're going to slam the gates on history so hard that that everyone will stand back in shock, things like that. To somebody like Kim, who seems like he might actually be a lunatic, which his father was not. His father was level-headed, generally speaking. He knew what he was doing. With Un, it's not so simple to say that he does. We're not sure. They called him untested when he first took power. Now he's been tested, but he's been acting deranged. He's drinking heavily, apparently. He's spending a great deal of his time with Dennis Rodman. You'd have to be crazy to do that. And he's constantly threatening far more than his father did. He is a warmonger, it seems. And here's the other thing, and the final thing that I'll say before closing the video. North Korea has changed because now they're executing Chinese puppets and so forth. But South Korea and the United States' stance in that region has changed too. The United States before basically told its troops, you're cannon fodder. Now they've told the 30,000 troops we have there that under any provocation whatsoever of a physical nature, a single artillery shell, a single bomb, a single shot fired across the DMZ, under any circumstances, they may be called into active war at a moment's notice. The South Koreans, additionally, have become more militaristic and nationalistic in the last few years. Because the last time that Kim Jong-il, the father of the current president of North Korea, when Il was president and he attacked those islands with artillery, and the South fired a few volleys back and no one really got hurt. There were a few deaths, a few destroyed homes, and that was all. When that happened, the United States was not on top readiness, number one. We weren't looking for an excuse to kick them out, number two. The Chinese were squarely behind the DPRK, number three, and the South Koreans were run by individuals who were more pacifistic, number four. All four of these things have changed. If Kim Jong-un attacks South Korea by shelling an island or sending a token bomber over to drop messages in bottles on them saying how great Kim is, somebody could theoretically mistake that for an actual sign of war and fire back, and things could escalate very quickly. You wouldn't have had that under the previous circumstances. Everyone was worried about China, which no longer seems to care. The South Koreans didn't really have the heart to fight them anyway, other than sending off a few token volleys. And the United States had a generally hands-off approach, because you've got to understand, when Kim Jong-il was the president, it was clear that any time he acted aggressive or threatening, that it was all for show. It was to give his own people a good time, to show them that he was in charge, and to get more aid. But without the aid flowing, and with famine hitting the DPRK, that has changed. I think that the execution of Jang and all of these other things happening in North Korea signal a turning point in the peninsula. I think that war is fairly likely within the next certainly decade. I think it will have happened by then. Next year, who knows? But things seem to be heating up over there, and this is not the usual rhetoric. And there is one final thing. People often say, well, North Korea is always making crazy threats. No, it hasn't. Until this last March, North Korea was relatively mum, generally speaking. You didn't really hear a lot of these things being said. Kim Jong-il was known for not saying a lot. He was known for saying a lot to his people and not really addressing the outside world. We haven't seen that with Un. This could be some form of new strategy to try to scare people, or it could be genuine. He could actually be crazy enough or desperate enough to attack South Korea, which is something that nobody would have believed with Kim Jong-il. Peace out.